Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm really happy you're able to join us today. My name is Sherry Shun. I'm the coordinator of 10 Mini University, and I'm happy to be the first presenter to kick off our noontime chat series today. From today on through the end of May, we're going to have weekly presentations Wednesday, noon to 1, on essential gardening information. For people who are not familiar with the 10 Mini University trademark, it is an Oregon State University program that offers short classes, videos, and handouts on essential gardening information. OSU owns the trademark, and Master Gardeners develop and manage the program with help from OSU faculty. I've mentioned that today's class is the first of our 2022 webinar series. All of these classes are recorded and will be put out to YouTube. If you have registered for the class, you will receive an email with the link to the recording. And for future events, please check out updates in our website, cmastergardeners.org, and also you can find us on Facebook. Today's talk will focus on ornamental plants, and next week, I'm going to give a talk on fruit tree pruning. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. We anticipate a really huge turnout today, and we suspected that there will be a lot of pruning questions. So we're lucky to have Patty Driscoll, a fellow Master Gardener and a pruning expert, answering questions that are put into the Q&A box as I give this presentation. After my presentation, Jane Collier, a fellow Master Gardener, and I will have a Q&A session and address more questions. And in addition, into the chat box will be links and pertinent information that will be put in there by Sean Van Doren, also a fellow Master Gardener and member of the 10 Minute U team. Pruning is a subject that is quite simple yet complex. Simple in the principles that govern how we prune when we prune. But there are so many complexities in the actual execution. So I recommend that you check out some of the handouts and videos under the 10 Minute University tab at the C Master Gardeners website, because for me at least, the more I learn and look at what other people do, the more ideas I get and the more confident I become. So here is a snapshot of many videos that we have done. These videos are shot in the field, showing hands-on pruning demonstrations. And they're short, they're 3 to 5 minutes or so. And we have plans to make more. And if you have ideas, feel free to put your nomination into the evaluation, that the survey that will come up at the end of the class. So these are my objectives for the next hour, that when we're done, you will know how to use the 2 major types of pruning cuts, heading and thinning. You will understand how timing affects plant response, and that you will learn how to shape and prune 3 major groups of plants, and they are deciduous and broadleaf evergreen trees, ornamental shrubs, and conifers. So let's begin with the 2 types of cuts, heading cuts and thinning cuts. Heading cuts remove the tip or a portion of a branch. And the result is the branch that's cut becomes bushier. Thinning cuts remove the branch at its point of origin, which means take out the whole thing. And the result is a plant that's more open. So they have opposite effects. And why does a heading cut make the branch bushier? Well, it has to do with auxin. So take a look at the illustration on the left. Auxin is a hormone that concentrates at the tip, the most active growing region of the plant. So in this illustration, auxin is the highest at the terminal bud, at the point, and it travels by gravity. If we make a heading cut, which is to remove the tip or a portion of the branch, what we have done is remove the auxin. Now, because auxin inhibits new growth below the tip, the top bud, and this allows the top bud to have a dominant position and grow well. If the tip is removed, auxin is not working anymore, and the buds below are free to grow. As a result, we have a branch that becomes bushier. So we know auxin moves by gravity, and the result, the impact of auxin is the strongest in the vertical branch, moderate in an angle, and hardly in effect when the branch is horizontal. Now, if we're cutting a small branch, in the past, we have told you, and in fact, this is the small illustration on the left is what I used last year. We had said cut at a 45-degree angle to an outward facing bud away from the bud. However, that has been proven to be perhaps fits with common sense and sounds right, but it's not proven by science. And in fact, science supports this approach, which is shown in the right half of this slide. Make a cut that's perpendicular to the stem because it results in a cut surface that's smallest compared to an angle cut, and therefore allowing the plant to heal faster. So this illustration, the pair of illustrations show if you have alternate buds in the left, you would cut to the bud that you want, which would be normally an outward facing bud at 45-degree, perpendicular to the stem. And likewise, if the buds are opposite, cut slightly above the pair. Usually the recommendation is roughly a 1/4 inch above the buds below. If you're making a large cut of a branch, usually the recommendations are branch diameter is an inch or 1.5 inches or larger. There can be a lot of weight associated with these branches, and there is a risk of the branch pulling down and peeling the bark, creating a large damage to the tree. So the best approach is to make it in 3 steps. Step 1 is marked with A. It's an undercut 12 inches out. Then you go further out and make a through cut to remove the weight of the branch, and that's labeled B. And the third cut is labeled C to remove the stub, but it's outside of the branch collar. And if we make the correct cut and preserve the branch collar, the tree will heal. And here's a picture showing how the cut is closing itself. And this shows branch collar. All right, so first take a look at the branch bark ridge. The branch bark ridge is formed when the stem or the branch is growing and the bark from the stem and the bark from the trunk push against each other. And so from the branch bark ridge, you look toward the stem end. And in this tree, you find an area that's sort of swollen. And that's where the branch collar is. Collar is a very important area in the tree because it's packed with chemicals that will hinder decay. So if we make a cut of a large branch, look at the photo on the right, cut along the line marked yes, but not closer toward the trunk, which would be damaging the collar and leaving a horrible scar. When I have to mark the cut on a large branch, usually I have someone else do it, but I would use a color tape, like some kind of a masking tape, or a piece of chalk to mark up where to make the cut. So it's placed correctly. And when I walk around my neighborhood, I make a practice of looking at the different trees and try to identify the branch collar. And I have to say, in some trees, it's quite easy. It doesn't always look swollen like the picture I showed you earlier, but it often looks different. It could be very wrinkled. It just often it looks different and distinctive, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you just can't find the collar. And so here's a shortcut. If you can't locate the branch collar, this is how you figure out where to make the cut. First, you find the bark ridge. They're always visible. Then you draw an imaginary line that is parallel to the trunk. And then you figure out, you estimate the angle between the branch ridge and that imaginary line. And then you duplicate the angle on the opposite side. And that's where you can figure out your cut line. Something else to keep in mind, if you have made a good cut, that cut should look oval. It should look like it should look like a circle. It should be round. If the cut is not made correctly, often it's made in the shape of an oval. And so always go for the shortest, the smallest surface, and that is a circle. So when you draw the line and think about where you might make the cut, also check to see if it looks like it's going to create a circle, which is desirable. All right, let's move on and talk about how timing affects plant growth after the plant is pruned. So we know if we want to stimulate new growth, we want to prune in the winter. In the winter, it's easier to see the plant structure. And in addition, when spring comes, that pruning is going to stimulate growth. Just bear in mind, hard cuts will encourage very vigorous growth response and often encourage what we call water sprouts, which is the term for the vertical shoots reaching for the sky. And also, when we make cuts in the winter, it's going to take longer to dry. So For plants that may be easily attacked by pathogen, it may not be such a good time. Now, summer could be a good time to prune varieties where the wounds are vulnerable to pathogens, because during the summer, at least in the Pacific Northwest, we tend not to have much rain or any rain at all. So the wounds are going to heal faster. However, removing the foliage is taking away the plant's ability to make food through photosynthesis. So pruning during the summer will slow the growth by reducing the foliage. And if we're pruning too much, we can weaken the plant. And of course, for flowering trees and shrubs, it's best to prune after the flowers. And for the plants that bloom in the spring, they should have been pruned previous summer after bloom. And those plants that bloom in the summer, they should be pruned late winter to stimulate growth, and they will bloom on this current season's wood. So here are some general guidelines for timing. Anytime if you have dead, disease, damage, or dysfunctional. Dead, disease, and damage are self-explanatory. Dysfunctional means, for example, a branch is growing toward the center, or two branches are grown together, rubbing against each other, and is going to cause damage down the road. That would be dysfunctional. And they should be taken off the plant as soon as you notice them. So anytime is good. But we don't want to prune during extreme cold or heat because the plants are already under stress. And we don't want to prune at planting or transplanting because, again, these processes stress the plants out. In addition, in early spring, we don't want to prune for plants that are what's called post-dormancy bleeders, which means that as they come out of dormancy, just beginning to grow, that any wound is going to cause the plant the tree to lose a lot of sap. And that's considered to be not so healthy. And also don't prune in late summer and early fall, because during that period, the plant is getting ready for the dormant period and putting energies into reserve. So it's again, a more vulnerable period and best not to prune. And finally, as I had mentioned earlier, if you want the blooms, you want to bloom after flowers are done, whether it's a tree or a shrub. So finally, let's talk about how to shape and prune groups of plants. And we'll begin with deciduous and broadleaf evergreen trees. All right, before pruning, I'd like to ask myself, what is the reason for pruning? Is it because I want to accentuate the natural form? Like in this photo, this beautiful tree here is a dogwood tree, and it has a natural kind of a lateral branches that goes really wide and looks very elegant. So if I want to accentuate the form of this tree, I might walk around it and shorten or remove or thin out some of the branches that are not supporting that natural form. Sometimes we prune, for example, in hedge or topiary, because we want something that's the opposite of natural. We want an unnatural shape to please our eyes. For example, with boxwood or yew. Often we're planning for health. I had mentioned the 4 Ds: dead, disease, damage, or dysfunctional. Take them out anytime. And but especially in young trees, we need to be looking at the framework and the branch angle And that's something that we can fix with pruning. And I'll say a little bit more about that next. And finally, we often prune for better production of fruit and flowers. So it's important to know how your tree is supposed to be shaped before pruning. And one thing I want to mention is also keep in mind that young trees tend to be more upright and slender, while mature trees tend to become wider in the middle and more rounded at the top. So keep that in mind when you take a pruning tool to a plant. So the desired framework for a young tree, pruning is essential to give it a good branch placement and orientation. So what do I mean? When you look at a trunk of a tree, the branches should have vertical distance between them. And depending on the mature size of the tree, etc., they could be anywhere from 6 inches to perhaps 24 inches apart, as measured by the point of attachment to the main trunk. And if you're looking at this tree from the top down, the branch attachment ideally will become kind of will give it a 360-degree coverage. So they should look kind of like spokes of a wheel radiating from the center. And the branch angle, when two branches join, whether it's a side shoot joining a trunk or just two branches coming together, ideally, the angle of attachment should be about 45 degrees or wider. If we have a very narrow attachment, like in the illustration on the right, often bark will grow into the point of attachment and keep keep the attachment from becoming strong, because the bark interferes with the hard wood growing together. And I'll show you the evidence of what happened here. So this is bark inclusion in the right photo. And that's supposed to be the joint of two branches. But because the branch angle was so narrow, bark grew into it. And so instead of wood joining wood, it's wood joining wood for a portion, but a large part of it was just bark. So there was no attachment at all. And I took this picture in the winter of 2021, almost a year ago, after an ice storm. And the tree, before I took the photo, the branches, see how these two branches are squished together really tight? So that was a very narrow crotch angle. Hardly anything is available there. So the important thing is, obviously, when the tree is this size and we notice a problem, it's too late. But when you are shopping in the nursery, look carefully at the placement of the branches and the angle of attachment, and make sure you're choosing a good tree from the nursery. Most of the time, we would recommend against making huge cuts in mature trees and removing large branches. But once in a while, it may be a good idea or it may be necessary. So here's an example. The illustration on the left shows a mature tree that is supposed to be grown in a central leader form, which means that it should have one leader that's dominant in the center. However, over the years, some of the side branches have become quite large and are shading out the center. And we want to keep the tree, but we need to correct the form. So how do we do that? Well, this is what we do. Step one, we will make reduction cuts on the side branches. I'll show you the details. So that's here and here. In step two, we will watch the plant respond and see what happened, then make a further decision. So we wait and observe. And after we've waited and observed for maybe a year or maybe 2 years, and we decided, well, it's still not working, then we may decide to remove these side branches altogether. So if we're going to make the reduction cut, as I described in step one, this is how you do it. Look at the illustration on the right that says reduction cut. So we are going to remove, when the two branches come together, the bigger part of the two branches. Usually in normal pruning, when we make a thinning cut, we're removing the smaller branch of where there is a joint. But in this instance, because we're trying to subordinate this branch, basically weaken it in order for the central leader to get a chance to catch up and develop, we are going to remove the bigger, stronger stem at the joint. And after we do that, we'll repeat the reduction cut. And so you can see the before and after. Okay, so when we're pruning deciduous tree and broadleaf evergreen, we want to keep it to a natural form. Often the pruning is a task of balancing the trunk with the foliage. And I've mentioned in the young tree, it's important to look at the framework and the branch angle. And in the mature tree, in general, we're just looking for crossing branches, take them out. And we're also looking to see if the foliage is so dense that it will create dark centers in the middle and causing branches and leaves to die out. So some selective thinning of the canopy to allow dapple sunlight to go through would be a good idea. Now, this is an example of how we might showcase the foliage in the tree. But sometimes we might choose to accentuate the trunk under a foliage canopy. And in this example, obviously, that gives the additional benefit of growing shade-loving plants under the tree. Again, I like to, when I work with a tree, I like to stand underneath in the middle of summer and when the sun is overhead, and just look up and look down and see if I can see the sky looking up, just small holes or patches of sky. And then I look underneath the tree and see if there's dapple sunlight. That would be ideal. And if we're pruning something that has a weeping form, the information I mentioned about branch location and the crotch angle still apply to the weeping form. But in the weeping tree, we value twist and turn. So we often will cut to an inward facing bud instead of an outward facing bud, which will then give us that twist and turn. All right, that's all I'm going to say about trees, and let's go on to some ornamental shrubs. I've seen a lot of very congested looking ornamental shrubs in my neighborhood. And for many of the shrubs that grow stems directly from the ground, such as this spirea, it can easily get out of hand if we don't thin it out periodically. So if the goal is to thin it out and open up the center of the plant to air and air circulation and sunlight, then we want to use mostly thinning cuts. And if you want to thin out something like this, it's best to begin close to the ground, getting there with your lopper or saw, and look for the oldest, gnarliest looking branch and cut it as close to the ground as possible. The reason for beginning low is because one low cut could be worth, what, 10 to 30 small cuts above. And we want to simplify the pruning as much as possible. So first, remove the really old branches because they're less productive, and taking them out will give us the greatest result in opening up the plant. And you can remove up to a third of those. And then look at the crossing branches, take those out. And if you want to reduce the overall size of this shrub, you can shorten the shoot by cutting to a new bud. Now, sometimes we grow the ornamental shrub because we really like the foliage. A good example would be this Catina's Golden Spirit. So in this instance, you could use a different approach, which is hard prune in the spring to stimulate a flush of new foliage that will have bigger leaves, fresher in appearance, and you're using mostly heading cuts. And so in this instance, you're actually cutting the stems to a fairly short distance. It could be anywhere from 2 inches to maybe 6 inches, depending on how high you want the foliage to grow. I've done this to my smoke tree because I like the foliage over the flowers, and I've had excellent result. Some of the shrubs are grown to give us really colorful bark, like in the shrubby dogwood, cornus, or salix, willow, in this photo, and rubus. So the way to cut in order to achieve this result is something that once you're done looks really brutal. And when the same approach, and the approach is called coppicing, and the same approach done in trees is called pollarding. You can look up pollarding, put it in your search engine, and often it's done to trees like sycamore or ash, really vigorous growers. In this instance, you can, with the willow, you can cut it really close to the ground and stimulate the new shoots, which are really, really colorful. Or if you want to have a framework and showcase these colorful stems at a higher elevation, you can do that too, like in this example. So you form a framework at the height you want, and then you use heading cuts as close to the tip of the stem as you can, and that will stimulate the new growth and look like this. And this is done every year. But most often we're pruning shrubs because we want flowers. So with roses, most of them will bloom on new growth, which is growth that happened this year, the same season as the flowers. The exception would be the once bloomers. So if you have a once blooming rose, just prune after it's flowered. But all the other roses you can prune late winter. And it's the same approach as other shrubs. You thin out the canes, remove up to 1/3 of the old canes, cut as low as you can, close to the base, and remove anything that's crossing or weak. And then in roses, for the canes we want to keep, we want to use heading cut. So not thinning cuts anymore, because we want to encourage the remaining canes to be very bushy and leading to many more flowers. So here we will head back to an outward facing bud, keep the center open. And for tea rose, bush rose, floribunda rose, grandiflora rose, the different types, some get taller, some don't grow as tall. The length of the cane that you keep is somewhat dependent on eventually where you want the flowers to be. If you read a pruning book, you're likely to find people say, oh, tea rose, you should cut it to, 9 to 12 inches above ground. And if it's grandiflora, 18 to 24 inches above ground, etc. But for me, if you're a 6-foot person and you want the flowers at your eye level, and the growth in one season is 2.5 feet of cane, you can figure out where you want to cut your cane in order to have the flowers at your eye level. But if you're a shorter person, then you may want to cut more and still have the flowers be within reach for you to smell and enjoy up close. Now, if you have a rose that is supported, for example, a climbing rose, supported like in this illustration, you want to bend the canes in order to encourage flowers. Now, remember we talked about auxin earlier, the growth hormone that inhibit everything else down below from branching out. Well, in roses, we want just the opposite. The canes we keep, we want them to have lots of branches and therefore leading to lots of flowers. So in this instance, we want to bend these branches, put them at a 45-degree and even up to a 90-degree angle, and that's going to really maximize the flowers. All right, hydrangeas. Some bloom from new growth this season, and some bloom from wood developed last season. So that makes it a little confusing. And the best bet is if you know what kind of hydrangea you have. So paniculata and arborescens are the species of hydrangea that will bloom on current season wood. And so if we want lots of bloom, we will prune late winter, early spring. So I would say in another month is a good time to prune. And the general recommendation is you prune to a framework, like in this illustration. And the picture on the right is my hydrangea paniculata and the framework that I've developed for it. And you'll notice the illustration is pretty even in terms of how high the framework is. And mine is uneven. And that's because my garden style is more relaxed. So I did not want something that looks totally uniform. So this suits me. And if the hydrangea bloom on old wood, which means that the branches that grew last year, not this season, and that would include oak leaf hydrangea, quercifolia, and big leaf, macrophylla, and serrata, I think the mountain hydrangea, with flowers looking like these. Then we want to prune after flowering, and we only prune the stems with bloom. Now, lilacs, I remember when I first started gardening, I had these old lilacs. They're so fragrant, but gosh, were they way high up there. I could never get to them, as I have to bend a branch in order to smell the flower. So that's kind of frustrating. And in fact, the lilacs do tend to get really old and kind of woody. So here's what you do. Well, if you want the flowers, you will prune after bloom. And again, like what we've talked about before, if we want to open up a plant because it's so congested, we want to cut low and look for the oldest stem to remove first. So in this instance, with this giant lilac, get on the ground, look at all the stems coming straight out of the ground, pick out up to 1/3 of the oldest one. Well, you can tell they're old because they're really big and sometimes they have peeling bark and their colors are different. So remove those, and then there will be some weak stems that really don't amount to anything. Remove those also. Make the cuts as low as you can, close to the ground. And when you're done with that, stand up and take a look at the shrub. Obviously, it would have opened up a lot more. But the remaining branches are still probably too tall. So what you want to do is, if you want to bring down the height, you can shorten this tall branch to a strong side shoot. So this is recalling the reduction cut that I showed earlier. We're looking at a side branch and the top, the main branch, where they come together. We're taking out the main one instead of taking out the side shoot. And that will shorten the plant, and the side shoot will become, in a way, the new leader for the branch. And just keep in mind, your best blooms on the lilac comes from pencil-sized stems. So kind of give those priority as you are working on shortening branches. Now, consistent with my preference for plants not being too uniform, one possibility in this instance is to, allow for maybe 1 or 2 stems to stay pretty tall in the back, and then kind of use a staircase effect to make them gradually become lower and shorter in the front. And rhododendron and azalea, well, basically deadheading after bloom, very light pruning. However, just keep in mind, the species that have rough bark will respond to hard pruning. I have one of these in an area that's too shady, so it's never as thick and lush as I like. So I periodically will give it a hard prune to stimulate side branches develop along the stem. And fuchsia is the last shrub we're going to talk about. It's really a subshrub, but just keep in mind it blooms on new growth. So I know some people think their fuchsia at the end of fall, winter just looks so ratty. They can't stand it. They have to cut it back. And if you must, keep it to about 2 to 3 feet. But in the spring, you want to wait until new growth have come out before you cut to the new growth, just to make sure that stem is still viable. All right, let's get to conifer, our last group of plants. I should first emphasize, I really do not advocate active pruning of conifers, but here are some examples where pruning is justified. The photo on the left shows a bunch of dead needles and some branches in the center. That should be cleaned out. Photo in the center shows a 2-headed tree. That should have been fixed decades ago. It's too late, but it's a good example for this class. And the photo on the right shows a hedge that is leaning so far out and out of step with the rest. So these are examples where pruning is justified. In the stiff needle group of conifers, and that would include spruce fir and Douglas-Fir. They have buds along the green stem, but not in the old wood, just in the green stem. So you can cut anywhere in the green stem and you would be able to get regrowth. If I need to prune them, I will cut in late winter when it's dormant. So the new growth will disguise whatever, bald or vacant thin spot that my cut might have created. Just keep in mind, you want the tree to stay in a single leader form. As I had shown you the example of the two-headed conifer. And so it's a good idea to monitor your tree when it's young. They're the best because they're so flexible. They can grow from anywhere. So basically you can cut anywhere and you're safe. Pines grow out one flush a year, and we call them candles because they look sort of like candles. And so the thing you can do, especially with the dwarf conifers where you want to control size, you can shorten the candle and therefore reduce the amount of new growth for the season. You can keep the plant at the same size. It's kind of drastic, but you can remove the entire candle. And the best time is when the candle is actively growing to do this pruning. And the final group of conifers are Arborvitae, Chamaecyparis, cypress, juniper. They all have fan-like needles. And they have new growth in the tip and in random growth points along the green wood, but not in the old wood. So cut anywhere except into old wood and you're safe. And I just want to mention quickly hedge and topiary. I don't see a lot of topiaries here, but I do see hedges. And I think most of us already know that in the hedge, you want the bottom to be slightly wider than the top. And this will allow sunlight to reach the lower portion and keep it looking green and full. And finally, well, I have boxwood for hedge. And you probably already know about this, boxwood blight. Ugh. Well, Oregon Department of Agriculture is tracking boxwood blight in Oregon. It is here, and it's being managed, but it's, it can affect our boxwood. The cause is a fungus that thrives in warm and wet environment, and it can also be spread by water splash, so rain. So you want to watch for the dark spots or lesion on the foliage and on the stems, as shown in the picture in the lower left-hand corner. And I now only prune my boxwood in July and August, when for sure there is no chance of rain, because last thing we want is to create pruning wounds and invite the infection. So I know I have shared a lot of information, but this is just all advice on paper. I mentioned earlier, we have lots of videos, and this is one example of a video pruning a Japanese maple tree. And the beauty of video is you get to see actual hands-on work. And so I would recommend you check them out because it may help reinforce some of the ideas that you heard today. And the simplest way, our videos are all on YouTube, but I find it really difficult to find any video on YouTube. So if you just go to the seamastergardeners.org website, it's a portal. And under the 10-Minute University tab, you can find all of our videos there. And that makes it easy. And of course, the recording of this talk will be sent via Zoom to you tomorrow or the next day. So you'll have an opportunity to check out portions that you want to review again. And otherwise, in addition to 10 Minute University handouts and videos, Oregon State University have many publications, and Master Gardener has a helpline where you can enter information online and get questions answered. So lots of ways for us to engage in a dialogue with you.